Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Parshat Mishpatim. In fact, it's an unusual Shabbat this week, very rare, occurs about 3 or maybe 4 times a century, that we have a combination of Mishpatim and Rosh Chodesh and Shabbat Shekalim. Shabbat Shekalim is the Shabbat either on or before Rosh Chodesh Adar. This year it's on, and that itself is relatively unusual. And so if we were in shul this Shabbat, we would be taking out 3 Torah scrolls, which is not a common thing in the calendar. But back to Mishpatim, and I'd like to take a look at PowerPoint supplied by Jonathan again. Thank you so much. And here we are. So, Mishpatim in a nutshell. Following the revelation at Sinai, which was last week's parashah, that we have a series of laws, including the laws of the Hebrew servant, the penalties for murder, kidnapping, assault, and theft. We have the laws of damages and loans, the responsibilities of the 4 types of guardians, and the rules governing the conduct of justice by courts of law. Also included are laws warning against the mistreatment of foreigners, the observance of the pilgrim festivals, and the agricultural gifts that are to be brought to the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. We have the prohibition against cooking meat with milk and the mitzvah of prayer. Mishpatim contains 53 mitzvot, 23 positive commandments, and 30 prohibitions. God promises to bring the people of Israel to the Holy Land and warns them against assuming the pagan ways of its current inhabitants. The people of Israel proclaim, "We will do and we will hear all that God commands us." Leaving Aaron and Hur in charge of the Israelite camp, Moses ascends Mount Sinai and remains there for 40 days and 40 nights to receive the Torah from God. And once again, we have a beautiful painting from Yoram Ra'anan. And fascinating, it's one of the aspects of this week's parashah, animals on Shabbat. If you come upon your enemy's bull or his stray donkey, you shall return it to him. 6 days you may do your work, but on the 7th day you shall rest, in order that your ox and your donkey shall rest, and your maidservant's son and the stranger shall be refreshed. The truth is, this picture and the caption beg the question, what is Mishpatim all about? Is there a theme that we can detect? Lots of mitzvot, huge number of mitzvot, more than 50. Is there a theme that winds its way through the Sedra? And what about the business at the end? More about Mount Sinai. Is that part of what happened last week? Is it something separate? And if it is part of what happened last week, why is it stuck on the end of the Sedra? So these are some of the questions we'll be discussing tonight. And as we go to the main part tonight, I'd like to thank Emily, who every week prepares the slides in such a beautiful way. We finished last week with divine revelation, talking about divine revelation and 10 utterances, otherwise known as the 10 Commandments. We asked the question, where was Moses? Was he at the top of the mountain, or was he with everyone else? Does it matter? We spent quite some time last week talking about the theme of a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. How would we achieve this? How do we go about it? And really, the 10 utterances are the headlines of the detail. So 10 main things, we call them the 10 Commandments. That's the headlines of everything else that we need to know. Tonight, I'm going to be quoting Rabbi Sacks in quite a lot of detail. He had so many amazing things to write about this week's parashah. So first of all, an introduction to the whole theme of Parashat Mishpatim, in fact, to the rest of the Torah. Great leaders, he says, be they CEOs or simply parents, have the ability to connect a large vision with highly specific details. So, for example, parents bringing up a child, the child does something which is naughty, and it's for the parents to think, is it something that really matters, that is going to be a dent on their character as they grow up? Or is it something which is really so age appropriate, they'll grow out of it and we don't have to do that much about it? In other words, the parent is already thinking about the big picture. And if it is something that they need to sort out with the child, because otherwise growing up, it's going to be a problem, instead of saying to the child, you mustn't do this, say to the child, don't do this. It's not in keeping with the overall kind of person that hopefully you'll be one day. So Rabbi Sacks tells a well-known story about three men cutting blocks of stone. And they are asked, what are they doing? So one says, I'm cutting stone. The second one says, I'm earning a living. And the third one says, I'm building a palace. They're all doing the same thing, but the third one has got the big picture. Those who have the larger picture take more pride in their labor, and they work harder and better. Great leaders communicate a vision. Or in the words of Thomas Edison, genius is 100% inspiration and 99% perspiration. And this attention to detail separates the great artists, poets, composers, politicians, heads of corporations from the merely average. So it's important to have the vision. What's the vision? We saw last week, Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And we discussed in detail what that meant. We're going to summarize that in a moment. But it's not just enough to have a vision. One has to have a vision, know where we're going. But then it's how do we get there? And that is really more the details. So what is the vision? Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh. Well, in this week's parasha, it can be illustrated as follows. It's to create a society built on the principles of justice, human dignity, and respectful life. Rabbi Sacks cleverly shows how the Torah translates historical experience into detailed legislation, so the Israelites would live what they had learned on a daily basis, weaving it into the very texture of their life. In the parasha of Mishpatim, vision becomes detail and narrative becomes law. We're going to look at several examples now. Example 1. How do you treat a slave or a servant? If you buy a Hebrew servant, he's to serve you for 6 years. But in the 7th year, he shall go free without paying anything. In fact, elsewhere in the Torah, it's not just he doesn't pay anything to go free. The master has to help him, give him enough to actually start life properly on his own. Whether it's a job or money or whatever it is. So already we see this isn't something which is forever. Another example, one who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result. Could even be a capital case. A slave is not mere property. Most intriguingly, it's this one. It's Shabbat. Shabbat is mentioned in Mishpatim. But how so? 6 days, do your work, but on the 7th day, do not work, so that your ox and your donkey may rest, and so that the slave born in your household, that means it's talking about a non-Jewish slave, and the foreigner living among you may be refreshed. Everyone is entitled to that day off. There are, in fact, other laws, but I've just quoted 3 of them. And the way Rabbi Sacks puts it, all 3 laws prepared the way for the abolition of slavery, even though in certain parts of the world it will take more than 3,000 years. A second example, the widow and the fatherless. This is very striking because it draws from pre-Exodus as well. So in this week's parasha, it says, do not take advantage of the widow or the fatherless. If you do, and they cry out to me, I will certainly hear their cry. And the Hebrew is, Ki'im sa'ok yitzak elai, which they really cry out to me. Shamua eshma. We've got 2 sets of double verbs. They'll really cry out, and I will really listen. Sakoto, to their cry. So where have we heard something like that before? Prior to the Exodus, prior to God speaking to Moshe at the burning bush, just prior. Vayanchu b'nei Yisrael min avodah. The Israelites groaned in their slavery. Vayizaku, and they cried out. Vatal shavatam el Elohim in avodah. Their cry went up to God from the work, just as the cry of these unfortunate people who were afflicted in the earlier quote went up to God. And in fact, if we look at the top line, it says, Kol almana v'yatom lo ta'anun. So the translation says, do not take advantage. But you know what it really means? Don't afflict. And it's the same word used to describe our treatment in Egypt. So what we suffered in Egypt and the fact that God heard us gets translated into halakha, into Jewish law. It is shaping our law and the type of people we are expected to become. Here's another example, the oppression of the stranger. 2 quotes regarding the halakha in this week's parasha. The ger lo tonev lo tilchatzenu. You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him. I put tilchatzenu and oppress in bold. We'll see that in a moment. We'll see why. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Also in this week's parasha, a bit later on, the ger lo tilchatz. Don't oppress a stranger. V'atem yidatem b'nefesh hager. You know the soul of the stranger. You know what it's like to be treated as an outsider. Ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. 36 times in the Torah, this idea is conveyed. You were strangers. You know what it's like. You be careful how you treat others. And this is what Hashem said to Moshe at the burning bush. Va'ata, and now, hine, behold. Sa'akat b'nei Yisrael ba'ilai, the cry, we just saw about the cry of b'nei Yisrael has come to me, the gam ra'iti, and I've also seen what? Et halachatz, the oppression. That word means oppression. Asher Mitzrayim lochatzim otam, with which Egypt oppresses them. So these 2 words of oppression are lifted up into the quotes at the top of the page. Top of the page, lo tilchatzenu, lo tilchatz, oppress. You were oppressed. You know the soul what it's like. Don't do it to others. Don't oppress the stranger. So there are 2 types of ger. The word ger appears in the Torah, but it's not always clear which kind of ger we're referring to. So there's what we call a ger tzedek, someone who converts to Judaism. And Ruth is, of course, the best example in Tanakh of that. We also have what's called a ger toshav, which is a resident alien, someone who's chosen to live in the land of Israel without converting to Judaism, but instead agrees to keep the 7 Arachide laws. And these now are the words of Rabbi Sacks. Ger toshav legislation represents the biblical form of minority rights. They are entitled to be treated nicely. Now, why? What's the logic? Well, we can, I'm sure, we'll come up with reasons. But a couple of very nice ideas from the Ramban and the Orach Chaim, both of whom we quoted in recent weeks. What does the Ramban say? You were strangers in the land of Egypt, and I saw the oppression with which the Egyptian oppressed you. I behold the tears of those who are oppressed and have no comforter. Likewise, you shall not afflict the widow and the orphan, for I will hear their cry. God in Egypt was on the side of the weak. We need to be on the side of the weak. We're supposed to imitate God. So one idea is the powerlessness, and the other is the psychological vulnerability. They are, not in the natural environment, and therefore, again, be nice. Orach Chaim says something which I think needs a lot of attention these days. The sanctity that Israelites feel as children of the covenant may lead them to look down on those who lack a similar lineage. Therefore, they're commanded not to feel superior to the ger, but instead to remember the degradation their ancestors experienced in Egypt. It's a command of humility in the face of strangers. So, to be a Jew, says Rabbi Sacks, is to be a stranger. Let's think about that for a moment. So we know that Abraham was told, leave your birthplace, leave your father's house, leave everything that is special to you, special, precious to you, and go to a land that I'll show you. From that point onwards, Abraham was a stranger. When he came to bury Sarah many years later, he said to the people there, Ger v'toshav anochi imachem. I'm a stranger and a resident with you. Abraham was a stranger. Moshe, before he embarked on his mission to save Bnei Israel, was for many years a stranger. In fact, he named his firstborn son Gershom, meaning I'm a stranger there. All those years in Midian. And Moshe was forever the stranger. If you think about it, the Hebrew brought up in Pharaoh's palace, knowing, and obviously he knew who he was. That's how he took the action that he did afterwards. And then he went to Midian. Moshe understands what it is to be a stranger. And of course, we collectively as a people, not only did we have all those years in Egypt, and many of them bitter and hard, but even before we left, we're told to take the Pesach matzah amorah. Already then, but matzah amorah forever afterwards, to remind ourselves what it was in Egypt. And it's not just what was it in Egypt, it's and therefore. Atem nefesh hager, you know the soul of the stranger. And of course, we take the matzah amorah on Seder night, and we have the mitzvah, of course, of Haggadah. We're telling the story. We're telling the story. So now, this is the way that Rabbi Sacks puts it. I made you into the world's archetypal strangers so that you would fight for the rights of strangers, for your own and those of others. Wherever they are, whoever they are, because they may not be in your image, says God, they are nonetheless in mine. Now, we've mentioned memory as being really important. So, you know, the soul of a stranger means you have the ability to get under their skin, or to understand them. So he tells the story, and I don't know how to pronounce these words. Sanad Segedi. Anyway, he was I'm not sure if he was the head of Jobbik in Hungary, that viciously anti-Semitic party. And as time went on, he suddenly discovered that actually he is Jewish. Shock horror. He's Jewish. And then his erstwhile friend said, "You're Jewish." And they suddenly didn't like him. And it made him investigate what it is to be Jewish. And he changed his name to David, and he became religious. Not only did he discover his Judaism, but he chose the religious path. What had he done? A role reversal. From all these things, this modern story, but really what's all in the Torah, Rabbi Sacks poses as follows. There's only one reply strong enough to answer the question, why should I not hate the stranger? He says, because the stranger is me. Incidentally, Rabbi Sacks also points out, when you look in Bereshit, you look at the character, for example, of Hagar. Hagar, and could we even say a second part of her name means stranger? She suffered. There's no question she suffered, and the Torah arouses our sympathy towards her. No, she's not the mother of our nation, but the Torah is not without sympathy. Even Esav is not regarded as the Torah by a good man. But the Torah records his upset in extreme way when he realized that Jacob had taken the blessing. He cried a great and bitter cry. Who cannot be sorry for him? All these things are to build within us this approach to others, to the outsider. So now let's go back to the bigger picture. Let's just talk about that for a moment. The bigger picture. We find towards the end of the Sedra, we've had many, many laws. And by the way, there are so many more, as we saw in Jonathan's introduction. There are 4 types of guardian. Someone asks you to look after something, and then whatever the object comes to harm, or the animal comes to harm, are you liable? You got an animal that hurts someone else's animal or a person. Are you liable? You dig a pit, an animal falls in. What's the level of liability? This is groundbreaking. All in Mishpatim. There's even a law that talks about sabbatical law, Shemitah. But it's couched in Mishpatim in social terms. So you don't sow the land for that year, but we know that things grow wild anyway because it seeded itself. The grass would have seeded itself. The wheat would have seeded itself from the previous year. Not same quality, but still it seeded itself. And there's still fruit growing on the trees. Who's going to eat it? Says the Torah, Evyonei amecha, the poor of your people, give them access. And what they don't eat, says the Torah, give them to the animals. It is an extraordinary Sedra. More extraordinary when we realize the era in which it was stated, where none of this was around in the world. So these are the details. Somehow, these are building us towards becoming Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh. And at that point, the Torah then returns to the bigger picture. First of all, it says, if you want to enter the land of Israel and do it successfully, you need to keep these laws and you need not to worship idols. But then we get to the even bigger picture. Suddenly, we remind ourselves we're at Mount Sinai. God speaks to Moses, come up the mountain. The people say, Naaseh v'nishma. The song that they sing at Ilford Jewish Primary School, the school's motto, Naaseh v'nishma, we will do and we will listen. But what does it actually mean? So these are themes that we're going to have a look at now as we approach the end of the Sedra. So here's the first problem. There are many issues with this, and I just dwell for a little while on this, and then we will move on. So after these many laws, normally when God starts talking to Moses in the Torah, it says, Vayome Hashem el Moshe, and God spoke to Moses. It doesn't say that here. Here it says, Ve'el Moshe Amar, and to Moses he said, come up to the Lord with Aaron, Nadav, Abihu, the 70 elders of Israel, and bow down from afar. So what's this Ve'el Moshe Amar? Rashi says, this is the pluperfect, and it really means, and to Moses, God had said. When had he said, says Rashi? The 4th of Sivan, before the Torah was given. This really belongs chronologically in last week's parasha. The Ramban says, no, it's not pluperfect. So why does it say Ve'el Moshe Amar and not Vayome Hashem el Moshe? Why does it do that? And the answer, the Ramban says, is because all these commandments in the parasha had applied to everyone, all of the Jewish people, all of Bnei Israel. And now he's talking just to Moses. And therefore, for emphasis, he says, Ve'el Moshe Amar. Does it matter? Well, we'll see a bit later that it actually does. But let's see what then happens. Vayavo Moshe. Looks like Moses went up, but he came down. And Vayzaper, Moses came and he told the people all the words of Hashem, Ve'et kol ha-mishpatim, and all the Mishpatim. Now, the Ramban says, what's the Mishpatim? Well, it's all the laws we've had in the Sedra. Isn't that obvious? But if Rashi says this event happened before this week's Sedra, back in last week's Sedra, what's the Mishpatim? So you remember 2 weeks ago we saw in Beshalach that God taught Bnei Israel a few laws at the time of Marah, the bitter waters turning sweet. And Rashi says that's what this is referring to. Be that as it may, whatever it is, Moses came and spoke to Bnei Israel, Vayan kolam kol echad, and the people answered with one voice. And what did they say? Kol hadavarim asher beHashem naaseh. All the things that God has commanded, we will do. There's no nishma. Where's that gone? In fact, it comes a little bit later, a few verses later. Then says, Vaikach Sefer Habrit. Moshe took the book of the covenant, Vaikra B'oznei Ha'am, and he read it literally in the ears of the people. Vayomru, and they said, Kol asher diber Hashem na'aseh v'nishma. All that God has spoken, we will do and we will listen. The truth is, and again, as Rabbi Sacks points out, the word shama, well, yes, it often means listen, but not always. For example, the Tower of Babel, where God confused the languages, said, Asher lo yishma ish safat re'ehu. So literally that means no person will listen to the language of his fellow. It doesn't mean listen. There it means understand. And elsewhere, especially in the book of Deuteronomy, Moshe speaks to the people again and again. It talks to them, Lishma divrei Hashem, to listen to God's words. It doesn't really mean listen, it means obey. So here are 4 explanations. There are many more. What does the word nishma mean? And the combination of naseh and nishma. Naseh is we will do. But how does it combine with nishma, which we're struggling to translate? So the Talmud, which is quoted by Rashi, says, we will do, and then we will hear. Remember, Rashi said this whole section belongs in last week's parasha. So he could say, we undertake to do, and we'll hear. So what are they saying? Before they knew what God wanted them to do, they're saying, we agree. And then we'll find out the details. And that clearly means that this portion is out of sequence. And that such an explanation will not satisfy the Ramban. The Rashbam, who is Rashi's grandson, says, we will do what we've already been commanded. All the commandments till now. And we undertake to obey all future commands. And here Nishma clearly means to obey. Rabbi Isaac Arama says as follows, we will do and we will understand. Says Rabbi Sacks, there are certain things we only understand by doing. You cannot comprehend a faith from the outside. Doing leads to understanding. Of course, there are loads of examples in life. You can watch all the pictures you like or videos you like of people swimming, but if you want to learn to swim, you have to get into water. And only then, not only will you learn to swim, you know what it's like to swim. It can't be explained. And there's so many other examples. We're going to come back to number 3 in a moment. But I wanted to include what Rav Soloveitchik said, because to me it's also deeply profound. What's Naseh v'nishma? Naseh, we will do, is, he says it's like Ratzon Elyon, it's intuition. And he's quoting the Kabbalah when he says this, the Zohar. He says, sometimes you just do something because you know it's right, and often the very big decisions we make in life, for example, getting married, you can't do the pros and cons and this and that. And you take that to the nth degree, it'll never happen. There are times when you just make that leap of faith, and it can be getting married, it can be a career, it can be almost anything big. We do. That's the Ratzon Elyon, the higher will, if you like. Then the Ratzon Tachton is the actions that we then do to support it, perhaps the rationalizations we do to support it, the learning that we do to support it. I'm going to get a degree in X. That's Ratzon Elyon. And now I've got to work hard. No Ratzon Elyon will do that. And you know what Rav Soloveitchik reminds me of? Again, the whole theme of Mishpatim, the vision and the details. But let's go to this theme of we will do and we will understand. First of all, let's put it into context. We've quoted 2 verses which are fairly similar in this week's Sedra, but there's another one which is in last week's Sedra, and here it is at the top of the page. The people all responded together, we will do, na'aseh, everything the Lord has said. That's last week's Sedra. This week's Sedra, when Moses went and told the people all the Lord's words and laws, they responded with one voice. That's also unity. Everything the Lord has said, we will do. Na'aseh. Then Moses took the book of the covenant and read it to the people. They responded, we will do and hear everything the Lord has said. What's different about the third quote? Not only it's different because it says Na'aseh v'nishma, but it doesn't say all of them. The first quote says they all responded. The second one says with one voice, which is like saying all. The third one was not all. Why not? And Rabbi Sacks explains using what Rabbi Yitzchak Aramah said. So just to remind ourselves what he said, we will do and we will understand. There are certain things we only understand by doing. Cannot comprehend a faith from the outside. So what about understanding? Is everyone's understanding the same as each other? And clearly not. The words of Rabbi Sacks. Judaism is a legal system, a community of deed. When it came to Naaseh, the Israelites spoke together and with one voice, despite the differences between Hillel and Shammai, Abai and Rava, Rambam and Rosh, Rabbi Yosef Karo, Rabbi Moshe Isserles. All these are great people in Halacha that disagreed on certain details. At the level of Nishma, which is understanding, we're not called upon to be one. The rabbi said at Sinai, everyone received the revelation in his or her own way. And supporting this from last week's parasha, all the people saw the sounds and the flames of the flames, and each heard according to their own level of understanding what they were experiencing. And it's backed up by quite a number of other verses, both in last week's parasha and actually in Tehillim as well, that people heard what they heard on their own level. Do we have core beliefs? Of course we do. And here they are: creation, revelation, and redemption. By the way, these three play their way through davening, through the morning services especially. Before the Shema, we say the Bracha Yod Se'or, which is about acknowledging God as creator. Then we say the Bracha of Ahava Rabbah. We do the same thing in the evening, slightly different words. That's about revelation. God revealed himself to us, gave us the Torah. And redemption, Ge'ulah. God redeemed us in the past, will redeem us in the future. These three things are critical to Jewish belief. We believe that God is creator. We believe that he revealed himself on a one-off event to our people at Mount Sinai. And that obligates us. The Torah is divine. It's not some book written by some clever men or women. We believe he redeemed us in the past and that he will redeem us in the future. That's what we say before the Amidah of Shachrit and Mariv. Baruch atah Hashem, blessed are you Hashem, Ga'al Yisrael, who has redeemed Israel. However, within these broad parameters, says Rabbi Sacks, we must each find our own understanding, guided by the sages of the past, instructed by our teachers in the present, and finding our own route to the divine presence. What speaks to me may not speak to you. For sure, these core beliefs are core beliefs. There's nothing to talk about. But within that, we can have lots of different ways of looking at things. In fact, the Rambam Maimonides says in his code, where there's been a halachic decision, that's halacha. Two different, maybe three different opinions, but we can't have anarchy. But where there's a disagreement on thoughts, on views, on what happened, we don't have to say this is what happened. We could say this opinion says it was like this. So for example, the end of this week's parasha, did it happen as is laid out after the Mishpatim were taught to the Jews? Or did it happen before? Rashi says one, Ramban says another. Does it mean that one is regarded as, religious and the other isn't? Not at all. Both of them, with a careful examination of the words, are able to bring out proofs, as it were, to the way they see it. And that's absolutely fine. And that both views are discussed at length with other commentators going forward. So, what have we discussed tonight? We have seen that Mishpatim, by the way, the word Mishpatim means civil laws. They are the parameters of a civilized society. And other examples that we didn't discuss too much in length include restitution of damages to other human beings and to their property, and avoiding falsehood. The term midvar sheker tirchak, keep far away from anything false, is in this week's parasha. Maybe we should have put that in big lights as well. Even laws considered to be rituals, Shabbat and Shemitah, in this week's parasha are couched in terms of society, the needs of society. So Shabbat occurs many times in the Torah, I think 11 in total. And every time it's got a different aspect of Shabbat. This week is just make sure that everyone is included to the right to Shabbat rest. And we said, keeping these and avoiding idolatry are the prerequisites for Melechet Kohanim Goy Kadosh. So we can ask, where is the spirituality? Well, that comes next. So just to conclude then, the question is sometimes asked, to what extent are basic laws of society a part of Judaism? And there are some who say, well, really it's the foundations without which nothing else can exist. So next week's parasha talks about the building of the Mishkan, the holy service of Hashem. But by placing the Mishpatim here first, the civil laws here first, the Torah is telling us, the first thing is, make sure there is justice and kindness in the society in which you live. That is a prerequisite for being Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh, for being a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And if you want to know why, according to Rashi, all these civil laws are wrapped in between two accounts of the Sinai experience, even though one looks like it belonged in the previous parasha, Rashi will say, because you need to know that these civil laws are part of the Sinai, not just experience, but declaration. Only once we've got that straight can we move to the theme of next week's parasha, which is building the Mishkan. So we've termed this series from slavery to sanctuary. Next week is not the end of Shemot. It's going to take 5 more parashiot, two of which are doubled together. 5 more parashiot till we actually get there. But already in this week's Maftir, Moshe goes up to the mountain into the cloud. Leapfrog right to the end of Shemot, the last paragraph, the Maftir of Pekudei, Moshe goes into the cloud. This week's parasha, the cloud is Mount Sinai. In Pekudei, the cloud is in the Mishkan. We will see that the Mishkan was to be a permanent reenactment of the experience of Sinai. But more about that in the coming weeks. Meantime, wish everyone a good night.
Good night, Rabbi.